The morning sun had barely crested the ridges when the townsfolk dragged Mara through the main street. She didn't fight them. There was no use in it. A wiry hand gripped each of her arms, rough from field work and calloused from rope. Behind her, someone carried the short length of hemp that would soon bite into her wrists. They moved with the practiced ease of people who had done this before, as if her humiliation was just another chore on the day's long list of tasks. It wasn't her crime. Not really. Her father had earned this shame. His debts to the saloon keeper, his broken promises to the livery, his foul temper when the bottle ran dry, every misdeed carried her name instead of his. The town had grown weary of his apologies, his stumbles, his half-slurred bargains. And so, as had become their custom, they punished her for him. The market post stood in the square, a thick timber driven deep into the ground long before Mara's birth. Some said it had once been meant for tethering horses, but in the years since, it had become a different kind of anchor, a place where justice, or what passed for it, was made visible. Petty thieves, quarrelsome drunks, and more often than not, the children of men like her had all been bound there. Mara was forced to her knees, the grit of the street biting through her thin skirt. The crowd pressed closer, their boots scuffing the dust into her face. Someone spat near her shoulder. Another shouted that shame was wasted on her, that the girl was too proud to feel it. She held her head high regardless, because lowering it would only prove them right. Fetch the rope. One of the men barked. It took only a moment for them to fasten her to the post. The knots were cruel, designed to chafe with every breath. Mara's wrists already stung, but she didn't wince. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. The sun climbed steadily above, spilling heat onto her shoulders, reminding her that time would not pass quickly here. Around her, the marketplace swelled with the hum of daily life. Women bartered over flour and molasses, men shouted prices for cattle and grain. Children darted between stalls, giggling, though some stopped to point at her, their laughter sharp with cruelty. The world went on as though her suffering was merely part of the scenery. The punishment was not in the binding alone. It was in the gaze of every passer-by, the weight of every whispered word. Mara's cheeks burned with the knowledge that she was seen not as herself, but as her father's sin given flesh. They had tied her up like a warning sign, a reminder to all who thought a man's vices could be kept private. And yet, as the hours wore on, she found a stubborn strength in the stillness. Her stomach growled, but she pressed her lips tight. Dust clung to the sweat along her brow, but she refused to wipe it away against the post. A hawk circled above, patient in its watching, and Mara thought herself not so different. If she could endure, if she could outlast their stares, then perhaps she could rise above them. Every so often, a villager would toss a word like a stone. Drunk's whelp, they sneered. Like father, like daughter. One woman, broad-shouldered and red-faced, went further, flinging the heel of stale bread at Mara's feet. The crowd roared with laughter, as if the act were sport. Mara's stomach twisted at the smell of it, but she kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to bend, refusing to kneel in the dust for crumbs. What hurt more than the hunger, more than the ropes, was the memory of her father slumped across a saloon table, empty glass in his hand. He hadn't come for her this time, hadn't even lifted his head when the men seized her from their shack at dawn. Somewhere inside, Mara still wanted to believe he would change, that there was a man worth saving under the liquor and shame. But the silence of his absence pressed heavier than any rope. By midday, the air shimmered with heat. Mara's throat was parched, her lips cracked. The jeering had slowed, replaced by the steady churn of the marketplace. Only the occasional glance or muttered insult reminded her she was still on display. It was almost worse, this fading of attention. To them, she was no longer even worth their cruelty, just another object in the square, forgotten until evening. when the men would return to cut her loose. Still, she stood as straight as she could, her back pressed against the post, her chin unbowed. If they wanted her broken, they would have to wait. Mara had learned long ago that dignity was the only possession no one could strip from her, not unless she handed it over. And so, as the shadows stretched long across the square, Mara endured. By late afternoon, the sun was merciless, pressing down on Mara's shoulders until her skin prickled with heat. The rope had dug furrows into her wrists, small ridges of red that burned each time she shifted. Still, she made no sound. That silence, more than anything, unsettled the crowd. Most who found themselves bound to the market post wept, pleaded, or shouted back at their taunters. They cursed the men who tied them, begged for water, or sank into themselves in shame. That was the spectacle the townsfolk craved, the breaking of pride. Yet Mara refused to give them the satisfaction. She stood straight, jaw set, eyes fixed on some faraway point beyond the rooftops of the square. The people came and went, each certain their words might pierce her resolve. A wiry old farmer shook his head as he passed. Stubborn thing, just like her daddy. Knows no better than to stand proud when she ought to hang her head. A group of young men lingered longer, tossing cruel remarks at her feet like bones to a dog. One of them mimed drinking from a jug, stumbling in circles until the others howled with laughter. They glanced at Mara expectantly, waiting for her to break, but she did not move. Her silence became a wall they could not climb. They left eventually, muttering that she wasn't worth the trouble. In truth, Mara's stillness was not born of strength alone. She had learned long ago that words could be twisted, that anything she said would be used against her. The less she gave them, the less they could take. Silence was her shield, and though it weighed heavy on her, it was the only weapon she had. Left. Her hunger gnawed at her now, worse than in the morning. The loaf thrown earlier lay in the dust, trampled by passing boots, the crust broken into crumbs. Its smell haunted her nostrils, and her body ached to bend, to snatch even a piece from the dirt. But she remembered the laughter that had followed. The throw, the way they'd leaned in, waiting to see if she would debase herself for scraps. She would sooner collapse where she stood than bow for their amusement. Child broke from his mother's hand and wandered close. He could not have been more than 6, freckles bright on his nose. He stared up at Mara with wide eyes, not cruel, not mocking, only curious. "Why they tie you up?" he asked, in a voice high and guileless. The mother swooped in, snatching him back with a hiss. "Don't look at her. She's a drunkard's girl. You'll catch her shame if you linger." The boy glanced back once more, confusion written across his face. Mara caught his gaze and managed the faintest of smiles. She did not know if he understood it, but she hoped, somehow, he would remember it, that not all punishment marked the and marked thee. Guilty. As the hours crawled on, her body grew heavy. Her tongue felt thick in her mouth, her head light. Sweat soaked the back of her dress, yet she clung to her silence. In that square, bound to that post, she had nothing else to give the world but defiance. Even the vendors who had shouted loudest at first began to lose interest. They returned to haggling over cornmeal, over fabric bolts, over jars of molasses. Some no longer even looked at her, as if she had melted into the background, a fixture of the square. That indifference bit deeper than the insults had. For all her struggle to remain upright, she was still nothing more than a shadow to them, less than a woman, less than a neighbor. When the bell in the church steeple rang to mark the late hour, Mara's legs trembled. She shifted against the rope, not to ease her pain, but to prove to herself she still could. Her silence had carried her this far, but it had also isolated her. The world bustled and thrived around her, indifferent, while she remained frozen in humiliation. It was then she began to feel the loneliness of it, sharp as a thorn in her chest. Not a single voice had risen in her defense. No neighbor, no shopkeeper, not even an old friend dared to stand beside her. The town was united in its judgment, and her solitude pressed down heavier than the rope, but Mara whispered to herself, "In her heart endure." Endurance was all she had left to claim, the only way to meet their cruelty without surrender, and so she bore it hungry, aching, parched, and alone bound in silence, waiting for nightfall. Caleb Grayson rarely came into town unless he had no choice. He preferred the silence of his ranch, the creak of saddle leather, the lowing of cattle, the whistle of the wind moving across the plains. People said he was a recluse, and they weren't. Wrong. After the war, after the loss of his wife in childbirth, he had little taste for company. The ranch kept him busy, and solitude suited him better than the chatter of the saloon or the sharp eyes of neighbors. But that afternoon he rode. And for supplies, flour, salt, nails, lamp oil. Practical things. He intended to trade quickly, then head back before the sun dipped too low. The moment his boots struck the ground outside the general store, though, he felt the tension in the air. The square buzzed with the uneasy hum of onlookers. Heads were turned not toward the market stalls, but toward the post in the center dot at first. Caleb thought it was another drunk strung up for show. It wasn't uncommon. But when he edged closer, he saw her, a young woman standing rigid against the timber, wrists bound, eyes fixed on the horizon as if the town did not exist. He recognized her at once, Mara, the drunkard's daughter. He had seen her before, fetching water at dawn from the well, moving with a quiet determination that belied the reputation of her family. Caleb had never spoken more than a word to her, but he had noticed her strength, her grace in small movements, her refusal to slink or bow her head even when whispers chased her down the street. Now she was tied before them all, the rope biting into her skin, dust streaking her dress. He expected tears or anger, but she offered neither. Her silence struck him harder than any outcry could have. Caleb leaned a shoulder against the hitching post and watched. The crowd shifted, tossed remarks like stones, but she endured them without flinching. He felt a tightness in his chest, an old familiar ache, the same kind that surfaced when he thought of his wife, gone too soon. It was the look of someone holding themselves together, while the world conspired to tear them apart. He hadn't planned to interfere. It wasn't his fight. The town had its ways, and he had long since learned to keep clear of other people's quarrels. But as the minutes stretched, and as no one offered her so much as a drink of water, something in him hardened. Inside the general store, he gathered his supplies quickly, but his eyes kept drifting to the square through the window. A basket of fresh bread rested on the counter, and almost without thinking, he added it to his purchase. The shopkeeper gave him a curious look but said nothing. Caleb's reputation for keeping to himself discouraged idle questions. When he stepped back into the glare of the street, the square seemed to quiet. Perhaps it was his size, tall, broad, carrying himself with the stillness of a man who wasted no movements. Perhaps it was the simple fact that Caleb Grayson seldom appeared in town, and when he did, people took notice. He crossed the space between himself and Mara without hurry. His boots stirring up little clouds of dust, the crowd murmured, a ripple of speculation passing through them. He ignored it. Reaching the post, he crouched down, close enough that his shadow fell across her bound wrists. He unwrapped the cloth around the bread and broke a piece free. Then, without ceremony, he held it out to her. For the first time that day, Mara's gaze shifted. Her eyes flicked toward him, sharp with suspicion, then softened with something else, hesitation, perhaps disbelief. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. "Take it," Caleb said, his voice low, steady, more a statement than an invitation. The crowd gasped as if he'd struck a blow. Someone muttered that he was a fool, that kindness to a drunkard's kin was wasted. Another called out, accusing him of trying to win favor where none should be given. Caleb didn't look their way. His attention stayed fixed on the young woman. Before him, slowly, as though the act cost her dearly, Mara leaned forward. The rope limited her reach, so Caleb lifted the bread higher, closer, until her fingers brushed it. She clutched it like it was precious, more precious than gold, and brought it to her lips. The moment she bit into it, something passed between them, not gratitude alone, not pity, but recognition. He saw in her the same stubborn will to endure. That kept him alive all these years. Caleb rose to his full height again. "No one deserves to go hungry," he said, loud enough for the square to hear. Then he turned, gathered his supplies, and walked back to his horse, leaving the crowd buzzing. In his wake, behind him, Mara chewed slowly, her silence now carrying a different weight. For the first time since dawn, she no longer stood alone. The bread tasted of earth and smoke and salt. It wasn't the finest loaf, just the sort baked by frontier hands in iron ovens, but to Mara, it might as well have been manna from heaven. The first bite filled her mouth so completely she nearly choked, her body unaccustomed to food after hours of emptiness. She forced herself to chew slowly, to swallow carefully, as if savoring it might disguise the hunger clawing inside her. Every chew echoed against the silence of the square. The crowd watched, astonished. She could feel their eyes pricking her skin, waiting for her to falter, to look ashamed, to betray the pride that had kept her head high all day. But she didn't look at them. She looked at the man who had given it, this tall, broad-shouldered rancher with eyes carved from stone and a voice like gravel. He had already turned away, basket in hand, walking as if he'd done nothing of note. As though stepping through a crowd's ridicule to feed a shamed girl tied to the post was an errand as ordinary as buying lamp oil. Mara wanted to call after him, to speak her thanks, but her throat felt dry and tight. The words wouldn't come. She swallowed the second mouthful of bread and closed her eyes, willing back the tears that threatened to rise. She hadn't cried all day. She wouldn't start now, not in front of them. The townsfolk didn't take it quietly. He's lost his wits, someone muttered. A man like him meddling in what ain't his business, another said. Reckon he's after something. Kindness breeds weakness, came a third, bitter voice. Their whispers were loud enough for Mara to hear, but she ignored them. Let them talk. The bread was warm still, and each bite filled more than her. Belly had filled a hollow in her chest she hadn't known was so deep. For once, someone had seen her as something other than her father's shadow. A boy near the well called out, "You'll regret it, Grayson. That girl's cursed. She's got her father's blood in her veins." Laughter followed, sharp and ugly. Caleb didn't stop walking. He didn't so much as glance over his shoulder. That, more than the bread itself, struck Mara hardest. He hadn't made a show of it. He hadn't offended her with words or tried to shame the others into silence. He had simply acted as if no one's opinion but his own mattered. In a town where judgment ruled louder than law, such a thing was unthinkable. The rest of the day crawled on. Mara held the bread close, eating slowly, sparingly, to make it last. The crumbs clung to her fingers, and she licked them clean without shame. Each bite gave her strength to stand straighter, to endure a little longer. By the time dusk approached, the crowd had thinned. Vendors packed their stalls, children were heard at home, and only a few lingered, casting wary glances between Mara and the direction Caleb had gone. The memory of his act hung in the square like smoke, too strange to ignore, too unsettling to name. When the men came to cut her loose, they said nothing about the rancher. Their knives sliced through the rope, rough hands pulling her forward, until her wrists were free. The hemp had rubbed her skin raw, leaving angry marks that throbbed with every movement. She cradled them against her chest, the crust of bread still clutched in one hand. "You're lucky," one of them said as he shoved her toward the street. Another day of that silence, and I reckon half the town would have demanded worse. She didn't answer. Her legs ached, her back screamed, but Mara walked home upright. The small shack she shared with her father was dark when she reached it, the door hanging slightly ajar. Inside, he was sprawled on the cot, snoring, reeking of whiskey. He hadn't stirred when they came for her, and he wouldn't stir now. She sat in the corner on the floorboards, the last of the bread in her hand. She chewed it slowly, her body weary but her mind alight. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Mara felt a spark of something other than shame or resignation. A stranger had seen her, not the drunkard's daughter, not the outcast, not the punishment meant for another man's sins, but her. And in that moment, she swore she would not forget it. The bread was gone, but the memory of it lingered, richer than any feast. It had not only filled her stomach, it had restored something she thought she'd lost forever, the belief that she might still be worth saving. By morning, the whole town knew. News traveled faster than horses on the frontier, carried on wagging tongues and sharpened by spite. Caleb Grayson had fed the drunkard's daughter while she stood tied to the market post. A small act, simple. In truth, yet by dawn it had become a tale worth retelling in every kitchen, every shop, every saloon. At the general store, Mrs. Hargreave leaned over her counter, whispering to a neighbor. "I saw it myself," she said, eyes wide with the thrill of scandal. "He didn't just toss her a scrap, he walked right up, bold as brass, and put bread in her very hands." The neighbor gasped, hand to her chest. "What's he want with the likes of her? She's nothing but trouble, same as her father." Over at the saloon, the men told it differently. "Mark my words," drawled a ranch hand with too much whiskey in him. "Grayson's lonesome out there on that spread. He's sniffing after the girl. Why else would a man like him risk the town's judgment?" The men laughed, pounding the table, though none could quite decide if it was a joke or a warning. By afternoon, the whispers had grown teeth. Some claimed Caleb had taken a liking to Mara. Others insisted he'd been bewitched, snared by the sly charms of a desperate girl. A few, more practical, muttered that it was no more than pity, though their voices were drowned by louder, crueler tales. Mara heard it all. She couldn't help it, the town made sure of that. Every errand became an ordeal. When she walked to the well, women hushed their talk until she passed, then snickered behind her back. At the milliner's, 2 girls made a show of pretending to swoon, fanning themselves as one cried, "Oh, Caleb, bring me bread too." Their laughter rang down the street. At first, Mara kept her chin high, the way she had at the post. But by the 3rd or 4th cruel jest, her cheeks burned with heat she couldn't hide. She didn't know what stung worse, their mockery, or the fact that they thought her capable of scheming for pity. Caleb's act had been as much a surprise to her as to them. That night, her father returned home later than usual, reeking of whiskey and sour ale. He stumbled through the door, muttering curses. "Town's talkin'," he slurred, collapsing onto the cot. "Say you're whoring yourself out for bread now." Mara froze, heart pounding. "That's a lie." "Don't care." He waved a hand, eyes half shut. "Better you than me. Let the fool feed you if he wants. Man's a fool to waste coin on the likes of you." His words cut deeper than the town's gossip. Mara turned away, wrapping her arms around herself in the corner of the room. She wanted to scream, to shake him awake, to demand he defend her, but she knew better. He wouldn't. He never had. Meanwhile, on the far edge of town, Caleb felt the stir of the rumors but gave them little attention. He wasn't blind. He knew how people whispered, how they twisted truth into spectacle. Yet he had long ago learned not to shape his life around the opinions of others. His land was wide and quiet, his cattle steady, his house empty. The noise of the town mattered little when the prairie wind drowned it out. Still, when he stopped in at the blacksmith's for nails, he caught the sidelong looks. The smith's apprentice smirked openly, asking, "You fixing to bring the drunks?" "Daughter out to the ranch, mister. Heard you've got a taste for strays." Caleb's eyes lifted slow, steady, and the boy paled under the weight of them. "You'd best mind your work," Caleb said, voice calm but edged like a knife. The blacksmith himself quickly ushered the boy away, muttering apologies. Caleb left with his nails, but the incident stayed with him. He hadn't done the thing for attention or charity. He'd done it because no human being should be left to starve, tied up like an animal. That was all. Yet the town seemed determined to make it something more. For Mara, the days grew heavier. She wasn't tied to the post again, not yet, but she carried the memory of it everywhere. The rope had left its mark on her wrists, but the whispers left deeper ones inside. She couldn't scrub them away, no matter how tightly she clenched her jaw. And yet when she closed her eyes at night, she remembered the shadow Caleb had cast as he held out the bread, the steadiness of his voice, the way he hadn't lingered for thanks or applause. Whatever the town chose to make of it, she knew one thing the others did not. That moment had been real. And sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, when her father's snores rattled through the shack, she dared to let that memory warm her, the way the bread had warmed her belly. The second time they tied Mara to the post, the crowd was ready. It happened 3 days after the first punishment. Her father had spent the evening before in the saloon, losing what little coin he had left at cards. When the debts came due, he vanished into the hills, leaving Mara to face the anger of men who had grown tired of chasing him. At dawn they came to her shack, hauled her into the square, and bound her to the timber again. She did not resist. Resisting only made the ropes tighter. She pressed her palms against the rough wood and lifted her chin, steady as before. The square bustled with excitement, children tugging at their mothers' skirts, men lingering longer than their errands required, women with baskets pretending to shop while their eyes darted toward her. They were eager this time, eager to see the pride stripped from her face. But Caleb came again. The moment Mara saw him walking across the square, shoulders square, jaw set, she felt the stirrings of something dangerous in her chest hope. He carried no basket this time, only a simple tin flask in one hand and a parcel wrapped in cloth in the other. The crowd quieted as he approached, like a congregation awaiting a sermon. Whispers hissed between them. Some called him a fool, others a sinner. Yet no one dared to block his path. Caleb Grayson moved with the calm certainty of a man who feared nothing they could say. When he reached her, he knelt again, unhurried. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal smoked meat, a heel of cheese, and another loaf of bread. He set the food at her feet, then uncorked the flask and held it to her lips. Mara hesitated, her pride warring with her thirst. Then she drank, the cool water sliding down her parched throat like salvation. She closed her eyes, fighting not to gulp too greedily, and when she opened them again, Caleb was watching her with a look that wasn't pity, it was respect. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady. It was the first word she had spoken at the post. The crowd erupted with jeers. "Listen to her," one man shouted. "Got him dancing to her tune already." Another spat on the ground. "She bleed him dry, same as her father." Caleb rose, his gaze sweeping the square. His silence was heavier than any shouted rebuke. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back the way he had come, leaving the food where it lay. Mara bent as far as the rope allowed, straining to reach the parcels. She managed to grasp the bread, tearing off a piece with trembling fingers. The taste was rough and real, solid against her hunger. Every bite felt like a victory, not only over her empty stomach, But over the cruel stares of the people who wanted her broken Dot, by the time the men came to cut her loose that evening, the food was gone. She stood straighter than she had in the morning, her eyes bright with something that unnerved them. This was not punishment, not in the way they intended. Instead, it had become a stage for defiance, hers, and now as Dot the next time, Caleb came again. And the next Dot, it became a pattern. Whenever Mara was tied to the post, he appeared. Sometimes he brought bread, sometimes water, once even a wool shawl when the wind bit cold. Always simple things, nothing lavish, but each offering carried the weight of rebellion. He never lingered, never spoke more than a few words, but his presence alone was enough to rattle the town. Soon the whispers sharpened into anger. Women clucked their tongues, insisting Caleb was setting a dangerous example. Men muttered about his judgment, claiming he was softening, that he would regret wasting his strength on a girl marked by disgrace. Children sang cruel little rhymes, mocking the drunkard's daughter and her rancher. Mara endured it all, but now she endured with something new inside her. Each time Caleb came, it reminded her she was not invisible, not entirely alone. His quiet defiance stitched strength into her bones, Dot, and though she never said it aloud, each piece of bread, each sip of water, each shawl laid gently across her shoulders felt like more than kindness. It felt like a promise that someone in this unforgiving town believed she deserved to live. Dot, it was a small rebellion, yes. But small rebellions, Mara knew, had a way of growing into something larger. By late summer, the weight of her father's habits had become too much for even the most patient in town to bear. For years, Thomas Vey had been a nuisance, loud when drunk, reckless with wagers, careless with debts. But nuisance turned to burden, and burden to liability. Shopkeepers no longer extended him credit. Farmers refused to lend their tools. Even the saloon keeper grew tired of his half-coin promises. And still he drank, finding ways to barter what little Mara managed to earn from sewing or washing for bottles that kept him blind to his failures. One evening, he staggered into the saloon with pockets empty and eyes wild. He demanded whiskey. On account, swore he'd pay it back with winnings from cards he hadn't yet played. When the barkeep refused, Thomas turned violent, knocking over a chair and throwing a glass against the wall. The men inside had seen enough. They dragged him into the street, their patience at its end, and left him sprawled in the dust. By morning he hadn't moved. His face was pale, his lips cracked, his breath shallow as a whisper. Mara found him there at dawn, curled like a broken thing at the edge of the road. She knelt beside him, lifting his head into her lap. The smell of liquor clung to his clothes, but beneath it she caught the bitter scent of sickness. "Papa," she murmured, shaking him gently. His eyes fluttered open, dull and unfocused. "For?" A heartbeat. She thought he might rise, might stagger back to his feet as he always had before. But then his body slackened, and he slipped into a fitful half-consciousness. Word spread quickly. Some townsfolk came to see, circling like crows, muttering about whether the man was worth saving. A few said it was best to let nature take its course, that the drunkard had chosen his end long ago. Others looked to Mara with hard eyes, as though his weakness was hers to answer for. Dot, by mid-morning, the town elders convened near the square. Their verdict was cold. Thomas Vey was no longer welcome within the town's care. His debts would not be forgiven, his sickness not treated. If Mara wished to tend him, she must do so outside the community's grace. And if she could not, she herself would be cast out alongside him. The words struck Mara like stones. Cast out. As if she were nothing more than an extension of his ruin, as if her endurance and silence and dignity meant nothing weighed against the measure of his failures. She bowed her head, but her jaw clenched hard enough to ache. That evening she half carried, half dragged her father back to their shack. His weight leaned heavy on her, his breath rattling with every step. She laid him on the cot, covered him with the threadbare blanket, and sat beside him in the dim light. He stirred once, eyes glinting weakly in the dark. "You shouldn't waste your strength on me," he rasped out. Her throat tightened. "You're my father." His lips twisted, bitter and tired. "I was your curse, girl. Nothin' more." She wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words caught in her mouth. Deep down, she knew the truth of it, knew how his shadow had darkened every corner of her life. Still, she stayed by his side, dampening a cloth for his brow, spooning what little broth she could muster between his lips. For days he lingered like that, half alive, drifting between mutters and silence. The town no longer asked after him, except to remind Mara of their warning. At the well, women avoided her eyes. At the market, men spoke loudly about debts unpaid, making sure she heard. She was already marked for exile, though no one had yet driven her out, and always beneath the heaviness, the same fear pressed on her chest. When he was gone, what would remain? She had no kin, no land, no coin. Only the memory of Caleb's quiet defiance, his offerings of bread and water, his steady eyes that seemed to see her not as an extension of her father's ruin, but as herself. But could one man's kindness stand against the weight of a whole town's condemnation? Mara sat beside her father's cot, listening to the ragged pull of his breath, and knew the answer would come sooner than she wished. The drunkard was falling fast, and with him, her place in the world threatened to collapse as well. Thomas Vey died on a Thursday. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't rage or repent, didn't clutch at his daughter's hand with final words of love. He simply faded, one last rattling breath, one last shiver, and then stillness. Mara sat beside him, watching the life leave his body, and for a long while she felt nothing at all. No grief, no relief, just the empty quiet of a life defined by his shadow suddenly lifting. By morning, the town knew. They always knew. The gossip spread before she'd even pulled the blanket over his face. When she stepped outside the shack, villagers were already gathered, their faces hard, their eyes measuring. A woman with sharp cheekbones crossed her arms and spoke loud. Enough for the rest to hear. The drunkard's gone. Now what of his girl? She's no kin, no coin, no claim. She eats off the back of decent folk. Another man spat into the dirt. Best we send her packing. The road's wide enough for one more beggar. Their words fell like a sentence. Mara stood stiff, fingers curled into her skirt, her heart hammering. She wanted to shout that she'd endured their punishments, that she'd worked, scraped, and held her head high when shame was all they offered her. But her throat locked. She knew it wouldn't matter. In their eyes, she had no worth apart from the man who'd ruined her name. And now he was gone. That was when Caleb stepped forward. He had been at the edge of the crowd, as always silent, watchful, broad-shouldered against the morning light. He carried himself with the steady patience of a man used to weighing cattle or measuring the sky for weather. But now his voice broke through the clamor like a hammer on an anvil. "She stays," he said. The crowd turned, startled. Caleb rarely spoke at all in town, let alone raised his voice. He took a step forward, boots grinding against the packed earth. "She stays with me. I've land enough, work enough, and food enough for one more pair of hands. She keep my house, tend to chores. That's my choice." Murmurs rippled through the people, sharp and disbelieving. "With you?" One man barked, "You mean to saddle yourself with her shame?" Caleb's eyes narrowed. Her shame? He glanced toward Mara, then back at them, his voice hardening. "She's carried his debts, his punishments, his humiliation. And she's done it without breaking. If there's shame here, it isn't hers." The words fell heavy, silencing some, enraging others. You can't just claim her like stock, a woman hissed. She's no housekeeper. You'll ruin yourself. For her, Caleb didn't flinch. I've been ruined before. Lost my wife. Buried my child. I know what ruin feels like. This girl is not it. For a long, taut moment, the square hung in silence. The people shifted, uncomfortable under his steady gaze. Few dared to challenge him outright. Caleb Grayson was a man who kept his word, and they knew it. At last, one of the elders cleared his throat. If it's work you want from her, then. Work you'll have? She's yours to keep. But mark this, grace and her stain will spread to you. Don't come crying when her name drags yours into the dust. Caleb inclined his head slightly, as if the matter were settled. Then he turned to Mara. His expression softened, though his voice stayed firm. Pack what you need. She blinked, hardly able to comprehend. What? You've a place at my ranch, he said simply. If you'll take it. Her lips parted, but no words came. The eyes of the whole town pressed on her, waiting to see if she'd leap at the offer or shrink from it. For an instant, fear tugged. At her ribs, fear of owing him, of binding her survival to another man's will. But beneath that fear, a deeper truth pulsed. He was the first to see her as more than her father's ruin. I'll come, she said at last, her voice quiet, but steady. Caleb nodded once, as though he had expected nothing less. He held out his hand not to lead her, not to command her, but simply to walk beside her. Together they left the square, the whispers of the town chasing after them like a wind. For Mara, each step away from the post, away from the shack, away from the crowd that had bound her in shame, felt like the loosening of an invisible rope. For the first time in her life, she walked not as a burden, but as someone claimed, not by disgrace, but by choice. The first night on the ranch, Mara hardly slept. The house itself wasn't grand, just a weathered two-room structure with whitewashed walls and a roof that groaned when the wind pressed against it. But to Mara, it felt immense, too quiet too, empty of the familiar rattle of bottles and her father's restless mutters. She lay on the cot Caleb had prepared for her, staring at the rafters, listening to the silence. It was a different kind of silence than she had known before. In town, silence had been forced on her, heavy with judgment and shame. Here, it was wide and patient, like the open prairie waiting, not condemning. Morning came with the crow of a rooster and the creak of floorboards as Caleb moved about. He didn't wake her, didn't issue commands. When she stepped into the kitchen, he was already at the table, coffee steaming in a tin mug, a second cup poured and waiting. He gestured to it, saying nothing. Mara sat, wrapping her fingers around. The warmth. The quiet between them was not awkward, not sharp. It was steady, companionable. She realized then that Caleb was a man who spoke only when words mattered. And she found herself grateful for that. The days settled into rhythm. Caleb showed her the tasks of ranch life not with lectures, but with patient demonstrations. How? To sweep the hearth so ash didn't clog the chimney. How to hang laundry in the wind so it dried instead of tangling. How to mend torn shirts with stitches so small they near disappeared. At first, Mara fumbled. Her hands were clumsy with tools she'd never touched. And more than once she flushed with embarrassment when she dropped a pail or misthreaded a needle. But Caleb never scolded. He'd take the tool, show her again, then hand it back without judgment. His calm steadiness gave her room to learn without fear. In turn, she found ways to lighten his load. She scrubbed floors until they shone, cooked stews that filled the house with warmth, patched his work shirts with care. She discovered, to her surprise, that she liked the labor. Each chore gave her a sense of worth she had never felt before. No longer the drunkard's daughter bound for punishment, but a woman shaping a life with her own hands. Caleb noticed the changes too, though he said little of them. He'd returned from tending cattle to find the kitchen tidy, the table set, house brighter. Sometimes he caught himself watching her when she wasn't looking, her brow furrowed in concentration as she kneaded bread, the way she hummed softly under her breath when she swept. It stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years, a pulse in years. Quiet warmth, a stirring of life in the cold places of his chest, but more than her industry, it was her resilience that struck him. He had seen her tied to that post, seen the way she stood against a crowd's scorn. Now he saw it again, in smaller ways, in the set of her shoulders when she carried heavy buckets, in the way she refused to complain no matter how blistered. Her hands grew. Still, there were moments when the past clawed at her. At night, Mara sometimes woke from dreams of the market square, the jeers still echoing in her ears. Once, Caleb found her standing at the window in the moonlight, arms wrapped around herself. He didn't ask what haunted her. Instead, he simply draped a quilt over her shoulders and stood beside her until the tremors eased out slowly. Something shifted between them. Not romance, not yet. It was subtler, gentler. A kind of trust, a rhythm of two people learning to share silence without fear. When Caleb spoke, Mara listened, not just because he rarely wasted words, but because each one seemed to carry weight. When Mara laughed a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years, Caleb felt the walls of his solitude crack. Just a little. The town still whispered, of course. When Caleb came in for supplies with Mara at his side, people stared. Some smirked. Some sneered. Others muttered about folly. But neither of them answered the whispers. Their strength was in the quiet rebellion they shared, in the life they were building away from the market square's judgment. For Mara, every sunrise on the ranch was proof that her story wasn't finished, that dignity and belonging could grow in the soil of shame if someone cared enough to tend it. And for Caleb, every evening spent with another voice in his home reminded him that solitude was not the same as peace. In their quiet transformation, they found not rescue, but renewal. Autumn came early that year, sharp winds sweeping through the prairie and carrying dust across the streets of town. Mara walked beside Caleb as they led a wagon filled with wool and grain to the market, her first time back since her father's death. Every step toward the square made her chest tighten. She remembered too well the sting of rope against her wrists, the jeers, the scraps of rotten food hurled at her feet. She had sworn she'd never return. Yet here she was, not as a prisoner, but as a partner in Caleb's work. The wagon wheels creaked to a stop near the post. The same post. Mara's eyes caught on it, and for a moment she faltered. The wood bore the grooves of countless bindings, her own among them. It was a scar, weathered by sun and dust, and it seemed to whisper her shame back to her. Caleb noticed. He followed her gaze, then spoke low, only for her. That post can't touch you anymore. She drew a slow breath, nodding. His words steadied her like an anchor, though her pulse still hammered. The townsfolk gathered quickly, as they always did when Caleb brought goods. This time, though, their attention fixed not on his wares, but on Mara at his side. Whispers rose, like the rustle of dry grass. There she is, the drunkard's girl. Grayson brought her back. Foolish man. Just wait. She'd drag him down same as her father. The words slid under Mara's skin, sharp as glass. She kept her head high, though, her hand steady on the wagon's edge. Caleb began unloading sacks of grain, his movements calm, unhurried. When a man muttered loud enough for them both to hear, no decent rancher would tie himself to her. Caleb straightened, his eyes sweeping the crowd. You've all had your say about her, he said, his voice carrying across the square. But I've watched her work. I've seen her strength. She keeps my home, she earns her place, and she's worth 10 of any who waste their breath on gossip. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some scoffed. Others fell quiet. Mara's heart pounded at the bluntness of his defense. Caleb rarely spoke more than a few words, but when he did, they landed like iron. Then, to Mara's shock, he reached into the wagon, lifted a sack of grain, and carried it not to the buyers, but to the very post where she had once been bound. He set it down at its base with deliberate care, then turned back to the people. "This is where you tried to break her," he said, his gaze steady, his voice roughened with something like anger. "And yet she stands. She's not broken. She's not bowed. She's here, working beside me. That's the truth you'll have to live with." For a moment, silence clung to the square. Then someone coughed. Another shuffled their feet. The whispers dwindled, uncertain now, brittle where they had once been sharp. Mara felt heat rise in her chest, not shame, but something fiercer. She stepped forward, laying a hand on the grain sack, and spoke for herself. "You tied me here," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough to carry. "You thought it would make me less, but I am not my father's ruin. I am not your burden. I am myself, and I have a place now." Her words echoed in the quiet. She half expected laughter, scorn, another punishment. But none came. The silence itself was a victory, proof that their hold on her had cracked. Caleb touched the brim of his hat, calm as if nothing more had happened, and returned to his work. Mara joined him, her movement steady, her head held high. Together, they sold their goods, accepted coins, and spoke with buyers as if the stares meant nothing. When the wagon was empty and the sun hung low, they turned toward the road back to the ranch. Dust swirled at their feet, and behind them the post stood as it always had. But Mara no longer felt its pull. It was just wood, just shadow. It no longer owned her dot as they left town. Caleb broke the silence. "You spoke well." Mara glanced at him, surprised. "I was shaking." "So was I," he admitted, and a faint smile tugged at his mouth. "But that's how you know it mattered." The prairie stretched wide before them, golden under the fading sun. For the first time, Mara felt the weight of her past loosen entirely. She was not merely escaping shame. She was building something new. With every step beside Caleb, she walked deeper into a life of her own making. Redemption, she realized, wasn't in the town's acceptance. It was in the dust behind them, in the quiet resilience they carried forward together.